Are you just starting out in chess and seeing this all the time?
Oh my goodness!
Oh my God!
Oh my god! He made it with 6x! Oh my gosh! It's over!
Don't worry. Beginners in chess make plenty of mistakes, and we've put together a list on just how to avoid the most common ones. We can separate mistakes into 3 categories: opening, middle game, and end game. First, let's start with the opening. While there are always exceptions, in general, 3 principles should be followed in the opening. Control the center of the board. Develop minor pieces, bishops and knights, as soon as possible. Castle early in the game to keep the king safe. Common mistakes in the opening will often break these basic rules. Number 1. Moving too many pawns. The opening should have a few pawn moves, ideally ones that control and occupy the center of the board. Many beginners will make the mistake of playing too many pawn moves, delaying the development of bishops and knights. Also, the sooner pieces develop, the sooner the king can get castled and out of the center. Legal's mate is a good example of when lack of development and too many pawn moves can be punished. Number 2. Bringing out the queen too early. Beginners quickly learn that the queen is by far the most powerful piece, and so there can be an instinct to get it out as soon as possible. However, it's much better to start with the development of bishops and knights. When we move the queen out too early, it is likely happening when most, if not all, of the pieces are still on the board, so many weaker opponent pieces can easily attack it. This will cause the queen to make many moves in a row, while the opponent is the one doing all the development. Here's an opening where the black queen comes out early. As you can see, most of white's moves attack the queen, until the black queen makes one wrong move. Can you see how to capitalize? That's right, bishop b5, pinning the queen. Number 3, leaving the king in the center. As we mentioned in the first point, the sooner you can castle your king, the better. King safety is of course a top priority in a game of chess. It doesn't matter how many of your opponent's pieces you can capture if your king is vulnerable enough to get mated. It may seem like the king is not in imminent danger, so we may not feel the need to castle, but it's advisable, especially at the beginner levels, to be firm with the rule of castling as soon as possible. Here's an example of the dangers of keeping the king in the center in this game from 1910 between Reddy and Tartakower. You don't see games like this at the top level anymore. Fun fact, this game was used as one of the games Beth Harmon plays in a simul in The Queen's Gambit on Netflix. Now let's take a look at mistakes often made in the middle game. If we follow our principles for a good opening, we can hope to reach the middle game in a decent position. The middle game is where the game can get the most complex, with the most possible options for each move, so don't feel too bad if you make a few mistakes in the middle game. Number 4. Not defending our pieces. A term you'll hear often in chess is piece coordination. This means our pieces should occupy good squares where they can be active and potentially serve multiple purposes. When our pieces are undefended, they are more vulnerable to tactics for our opponent, usually in the form of a double threat. So ideally, our pieces should defend each other. This isn't always possible, but we should pay attention and try not to leave too many pieces undefended. In this example, can you see how to take advantage of black's undefended pieces? That's right, Queen A2, attacking both the rook and the bishop at the same time. Since there's no way for those pieces to defend each other, white is winning some material. Number 5. Ignoring the rooks. Once the knights and bishops have been developed in the opening, we should get our major pieces, rooks and queen, into play in the middle game. The goal should be to clear our first rank to get our rooks connected, which is to say there are no pieces between the 2 rooks on the back rank. Once this has happened, they should be placed on the best squares, ideally open or semi-open files. An open file is that in which there are no pawns from either side. A semi-open file is that in which we have no pawns but our opponent does. As pawns get traded off, some files will be emptied, and we should use them to activate our rooks. Beginners can often make the mistake of leaving their rooks on the original squares, effectively not participating in the game. In the absence of open files, in a closed position for instance, we can aim to have our rooks on the central files, behind our most advanced pawns. Here's a famous position from Steinitz von Bartholeben. It may seem relatively equal with equal material on the board, but white's active rooks against black's inactive rooks make all the difference in the world. Steinitz went on to win this game with the white pieces. Number 6. Pushing pawns near the king. In the opening, we castled to get our king to safety, but we must take care not to advance the pawns that protect the king. Not too far anyway. The pawns near the king should keep it shielded and safe, but when they move, they can leave the king unprotected. We should also look to avoid doubling pawns near the king for the same reason. Mind you, it's often a good idea to give your king some luft, which is when you ensure your king has an escape square. Moving a pawn near the king a single square can prevent you from getting back rank checkmated, a very common trap for beginners to fall into. For the castled king to remain safe, we must keep defending pieces nearby as well, especially if the opponent is brewing up an attack. Here's an example from Irene Charisma Sukander versus Lei Tingzhe. The Women's World Championship challenger Lei Tingzhe took advantage of doubled pawns in front of white's king, and in this position white can do nothing against the threat of knight f4, setting up a mating net for black. If white plays knight takes f4, the discovered attack of g takes f4 check leads to mate as well. Number 7. Playing without a plan. They say it's better to play following a bad plan than no plan at all. A common mistake is making moves for the sake of making moves, simply because it's our turn. Every move should have a motive. The goal should be to have a general idea of what to do. These ideas become more clear once we learn more chess principles and start to recognize patterns. Soon you'll be familiar with the quality of pieces, based on where they are on the board. Here are 2 tips for positions where it's unclear what to do. Improve your pieces, i.e., determine your weakest piece and look to improve its position, and figure out your opponent's plan or potential attack and try to stop it. Here's an example of a planless game. It should be totally even, but white had the plan of advancing kingside pawns and soon found a winning sacrifice. Black was playing more or less aimlessly, waiting for a draw. Can you spot white's winning sacrifice here? That's right, knight takes f6 check. If black plays g takes f6, there is no way to stop the g-pawn from promoting. Lastly, we'll look at mistakes in the endgame. Even at the high levels, endgames are famously difficult, so no one is exempt from mistakes in the endgame. Number 8. Not using the king in the endgame. We are taught to protect the king in the opening and middle game, so it can be counterintuitive to activate the king in the endgame, but this is exactly what should happen. By the time most of the pieces have left the board, the king can enter the game with relative safety with fewer potential attackers. Don't forget, it's a piece that can make threats and play a big part in the game. When one player can't activate their king, it's almost like they are down a piece. In this example from Grandmasters Ponomaryov versus Nielsen, white has taken advantage of his opponent's inactive king and placed him in zugzwang, a situation in which the obligation to make a move in one's turn is a serious, often decisive disadvantage. If the bishop moves, the pawn on b7 is undefended, and if the pawn moves to h7 or h6, it can be captured either way. Number 9. Not watching for pawn breakthroughs. Passed pawns can often determine the result of a game if they are allowed to promote. When we first learn the piece values, we are told that the pawn is worth 1 point, but it should be noted that their value greatly increases in the endgame, and even more so if they are passed pawns, if they can't be blocked or stopped by other pawns. Soon you'll instantly recognize the patterns to create a passed pawn. Here's a famous example from the 18th century that every player should know. Can you spot the winning sequence? That's right, b6. And if the opponent takes with the c-pawn, we have a6, sacking another pawn to give the c-pawn a clear path to promotion. If they take with the a-pawn, we push c6 to get a mirror image of the previous position with the same idea. Number 10. Not knowing how to checkmate. In order to improve your chess, it's not enough to simply play game after game. It can be quite helpful to know a few theoretical positions. In addition to learning the basic mates, queen versus king, rook versus king, 2 bishops versus king, you should learn some concepts, such as opposition in pawn endgames and queen versus pawn on 7th rank endgame. There are many simple endgames that are completely winning, but can be lost by a single slip-up. Beginner and intermediate players often prefer to study openings over endgames, but don't underestimate how interesting and valuable endgame knowledge can be. Here is a very basic endgame all beginners should learn as soon as possible: mating with the king and queen. The goal should be to force the king to the side of the board, with the queen moving a knight's distance away from the king. This means moving the queen to a square that would attack the king if the queen were a knight. You'll see on the board. Eventually, the king will be forced to the side of the board, at which point the king simply walks in to assist the queen. Watch out for stalemates. In this position, it would be a big mistake to move the queen a knight's distance away, as the enemy king would have no legal moves. Here is the perfect time to bring the white king in, while the opponent's king is forced to dance between a7 and a8.